All right, hello everybody. This week we are talking about Immanuel Kant, which is chapter 11, and John Stuart Mill, which is chapter 12. And I'm going to start with Mill because I think that Kant will make a little bit more sense if we do it in that order. So, both Kant and Mill contributed to a bunch of different fields of philosophy, but the contributions that I want to focus on, which your book spends the most time on as well, are their ethical viewpoints. We haven't really gotten anything about ethics. We've been talking about more abstract questions about knowledge and truth and certainty and all sorts of things. But now we're going to get into ethics, which is probably a field of philosophy that most people are familiar with without even realizing it, because everybody has a set of morality, everybody has actions that they think are right and wrong, everybody kind of wonders about whether things like abortion or the death penalty or whatever are wrong as well. We all have ethical dilemmas where we try to figure out what to do, and ethics is a part of philosophy that people probably spend a lot of time thinking about and are a little bit more familiar with, although maybe not with some of the theories that have been posed by philosophers and ethicists. So if you are more interested in ethics, I highly recommend you take an ethics class. We have them at Kish, and you can learn more details about these two theories as well as a bunch of other ones. So, John Stuart Mill lived from 1806 till 1873, and he was English. So we're out of Greece now, and France, I guess, with Descartes. And his godfather and personal tutor was Jeremy Bentham, which your book talks about a little bit, because Bentham is going to found the theory that Mill goes on to get all the credit for and be famous for. John Stuart Mill's father was also a philosopher, and a pretty reputable one at that, although John Stuart Mill, the son, surpassed his father's reputation and contributions by an extremely wide margin, as well as those of Bentham. So, a quick word about the childhood. Your book gives you little bios, and I hope you read those, and I hope you find them interesting. But I want to point out a few things about Mill's childhood here that hopefully you found interesting. Mill's father was under the impression that anybody could be a genius if they were educated properly. So this is, in the whole nature versus nurture thing, he sort of rejected that it was biologically or hereditary concerns or just specific, fluke brain wiring or anything like that. That it was if you raise somebody with the right education, they would grow up to be a genius. So Jeremy Bentham, fellow philosopher and godfather to Little John here, uh, bought into this too. So they raised John Stuart Mill as kind of an experiment to prove this point. So Mill wasn't really allowed to have a childhood. He didn't really have friends. He wasn't allowed to play. He didn't have free time. Your book gives you some of his greatest hits here about learning Latin and Greek by the time he was 3, and he was in England, so it's not like that was an easy thing to do. Geometry and arithmetic when he was still single digits. Graduating from Oxford at like 16. Total whiz kid. Now, in the way that they taught him, it was sort of like a Confucius and Socrates meld, but like way too serious. So instead of just sitting there and having the little kid memorize all of these facts and names and formulas and stuff, they made him figure it out for himself. And it wasn't until he had exhausted every single possible way of figuring out himself that they would actually help him. So remember, Confucius said that if his pupil didn't kind of meet him halfway, he would drop him. If the pupil wasn't putting in just as much effort as he was as the teacher. And Socrates tells us that education is not about filling an empty vessel, it's drawing the truth out of the pupil. So sort of these kinds of approaches to education, which wasn't necessarily meant for children, particularly not toddlers, and definitely not all the time. And this is how Mill was raised. And he did become a genius. He was helping his father write political philosophy when he was like a tween and had already established himself before he was 20 as a very reputable person. Now, whether or not he was already going to become a genius anyways, because his father was very gifted, and so it might have been hereditary, whether it was just his own personal biological hardwiring, whether it was effort or whatever it was, He did become a genius, so Bentham and John Stuart Mill's father kind of thought that they had proved their point, but who really knows? And it came at a big cost because Mill was never really allowed to be a normal kid. He was never really allowed to blow off steam and to play and to interact and all that kind of stuff. And it really took its toll. And he had a really severe nervous breakdown when he was in his early 20s and just kind of lost it and didn't really know what to do. And then he ended up meeting a woman who would eventually become his wife, and that sort of helped him calm down and find a way to love and things like that. So it's interesting to ask yourself if you knew that you could be a genius in whatever field you'd want. It wouldn't have to be philosophy. And it would come at the cost of having a childhood. Would you take that trade off? So if you're interested in the medical field, if you could become a genius and actually make some big medical breakthroughs, would you take the trade off? Or business or whatever it is that you're interested in. I think it's worth thinking about if you would trade that, and if you maybe didn't have a great childhood, then maybe that would be an easier trade to make. But it certainly is something that had ramifications for the rest of his life, good and bad. So the theory that Mill is famous for is called utilitarianism. It has like 7 I's in it, but it is phonetic. It's a very long word. Just a heads up, when typing the quiz, your word processing software is probably going to try to change utilitarianism to Unitarianism, which is a word that it seems to recognize, which is a religion and not at all what we're talking about here. So please proofread carefully, which you should always be doing, but in particular because your word processing software might not know what utilitarianism is. So, before we get into utilitarianism, I want to say a few words about hedonism. Your book splits up a couple different kinds of hedonism. Basically, in a nutshell, hedonism is the viewpoint that the only thing that really matters to us is pleasure or happiness. And it's the most valuable thing. So if we take all the things that we think are valuable, pleasure or happiness is at the top of the list. Even more than that, everything else that we find valuable is only valuable insofar as it brings us happiness or pleasure. So we value money. Well, we only value money because we can use it to buy stuff that's going to make us happy. So at the end of the day, it's really just about increasing our own happiness and pleasure. We value family. Well, you value your family because you are happier and your life is more pleasurable if you have a solid family that you can share with. We value health because life is more pleasurable when you're not sick and you're able to do lots of different things that you want. So hedonism is going to tell us that pleasure, happiness is good, and pleasure, happiness is the only good, right? Everything else that we think is good or valuable is only good or valuable insofar as it actually increased our happiness. Now, it might not. So you might think that dating that person or taking that job or moving to that place or majoring in this will make you happy, but it might not, right? You might be wrong about that. So we're not guaranteed to always end up happy or more pleasurable, but the idea here is that that's our only motivation. That's the only reason why we're doing this stuff is because we want to maximize our own pleasure and happiness. Now, the Greek root of hedonism is hedone, which literally means pleasure. And I'm kind of using pleasure and happiness as a tag team here because the original hedonism comes from back even before Socrates. But was developed more here at this time period with Mill and his godfather and tutor Bentham. But the reason I kind of tack on happiness here to the pleasure thing is because a lot of people think of pleasure as being just about like a physical bodily pleasure, like food and sleep and sex and things like that. And that's not all that's happening here because there are a lot of things that make us happy. And your book talks a little bit about Mill's distinctions about higher level pleasures and lower level pleasures. So we might not want to judge and say that certain kinds of happiness or pleasure are better than others, but there certainly is a difference between the pleasure that you get from, I don't know, a hug or a hamburger and the pleasure that you get from, nailing a final exam that you worked really hard for, or successfully learning a new skill or language, or a day at the art museum or something like that. So whether or not we really buy into the hierarchy, it does seem like that maybe there's a little bit of a difference. So, hedonism is not an ethical theory. So, what Mill is absolutely not going to say is something is morally right if it makes you happy or brings you pleasure. That would be an incredibly stupid viewpoint to have. Some people actually do. That's what the ethical hedonism is about. But really, all you need to do is think about all of the humans who actually derive pleasure from harming other people, right? So, somebody who's sadistic or violent or a murderer or something like that may very well derive a lot of pleasure from killing other people, and we can't have any sort of ethical theory that would tell us that that would be morally acceptable to do. So, I can't just be this free for all, whatever makes you happy is right. We have to have something more that kind of keeps people in check. Now, with an ethical theory, one of the things that's really difficult is it's impossible to go through every possible scenario that you might find yourself in and give you specific guidance for what to do. There are just too many possible variables, too many possible ways in which we might end up uh, being in an ethical dilemma and not really knowing what to do. So, the challenge here is for these ethical theories to give us a generalized framework, a procedure that we just then apply in all specific situations. And that's what pretty much every ethical theory is going to have to do because, again, you can't go through every possible scenario and give advice. So what that means is we're left with a framework that is going to apply to every situation, but stuff is going to fall through the cracks because life is very complicated and ethical situations and dilemmas are obviously very complicated. That's why we stress about what to do and what's right and wrong in that situation. So, we're going to have some exceptions to all of these rules that we're probably not going to like. But with a lot of these theories, and again, we're only going to get Mill's ethical theory and Kant's ethical theory today, this week. And that's going to be the majority of the ethics we're going to talk about for the rest of the term here, too. But the goal here is to try to have something that works in most scenarios and to know that none of them are going to apply across the board perfectly. We're not always going to get the right answer that we want. There's going to be exceptions. But a lot of these exceptions are going to be for people like serial killers and stuff, where luckily that's a very small minority of cases where we're going to end up with a result that we don't like. So, for most normal people in most normal situations, these ethical theories are going to probably be good enough guidelines. So, hedonism itself doesn't really say do whatever makes you happy and that's morally right. What it's about is our value priorities and our motivation. So it's not an ethical theory. It's more a theory about life, about priorities, about values, about our psychological makeup, all that kind of stuff. But it's going to lend itself to utilitarianism, which I'm going to talk about in the next video.